Okay, so Kate Raworth, welcome to this annual meeting of the Society of Argentinian Theologians. Thank you so very much for accepting our invitation to participate in this annual meeting. So the only thing I will say about you, Kate, is that you teach at Oxford University and that you consider yourself as a renegade economist, focusing on making economics fit for the 21st century realities, and that you love your family too. And I will also mention that you are the creator of Donut Economics. And finally, I would like to remember that you were quoted by Pope Francis in his book, Let Us Dream, written in 2020, where he praises for your innovative thinking. It's very, very unusual that a Pope praises an economist.
And thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this conference. I'm sorry I can't join live on Saturday. I will be on holiday with my family. But it's a real pleasure to have this conversation with you now. And yes, I was really honored that Pope Francis mentioned my work in his book.
Kate, let's start with the first part of our conversation. And given that most in the audience are neither economists nor specialists in economics, though they are clever people, I would appreciate if you could explain to us what is the main problem with the economy of the 20th century, and why are you therefore proposing a shift between the economy of the 20th century to the economy of the 21st century? In other words, what are the core principles and maybe graphics or images of donut economics and how they differ from traditional economic models?
That is a great question. And it's the reason why I am still involved in economics, because I'm passionate about rewriting what I call 20th century economics for the 21st century. So let me introduce you to this through 3 diagrams. You don't have to have studied economics to understand this. So I'm going to share my screen so that you can see these diagrams. 20th century economics, I believe we can sum it up in 3 essential diagrams. The starting point, the first diagram that students are taught in degree courses across the world is supply and demand. It's this diagram of the market. Now that puts the market at the center of our thinking from day one. It tells us that price is the key metric of concern, and it means that anything that falls outside of a market contract is called an externality. An environmental externality, that's climate change, that's ecological breakdown. For me, this is the wrong starting point. It does not give us the big picture that we need. It focuses our attention on markets when in fact there are many ways we provision for our needs and wants. And it pushes essentials of life like a thriving planet into externalities. So we really need a different starting point. Secondly, the self-portrait of humanity. It's a caricature known as Rational Economic Man. I drew his portrait because I thought he needed to be made visible. So he would be a man with no dependents, not raising any children, not caring for his parents, just an independent individual. He stands alone. He's got money in his hand because he interacts with the world through the market. He's got ego in his heart. He's got a calculator in his head, and he has nature at his feet. He hates work. He loves luxury. He knows the price of everything, and he can never get enough. And what I just described is the character of humanity that is placed at the heart of our economic models. We are modeled to be this way. And the more that we tell ourselves that he is like us, we actually become like him. We start to mimic the models we make, which is devastating because there is no way that 8 to 10 billion people can thrive together on this planet if we act and believe others are like Rational Economic Man. So we need a new self-portrait. And then the third diagram is the goal. What is the goal of the economy? This diagram is almost never drawn, but it's so fundamental. It sits behind every politician's speech and every economist's advice. And it is the goal of endless growth, of GDP increasing forever, no matter how rich a country already is. I can say this, I'm sitting in the United Kingdom. It's one of the richest countries in the world, but we've just had an election where both political parties were saying the focus is on growth, growth, growth in one of the richest countries in the world. There is no end to our demand for growth. So we have to have a different vision because we cannot thrive if every country in the world continually pursues economic growth endlessly. I don't believe it's possible. So these are the three foundations of 20th century economics that together create a very strong neoliberal mindset. It's market-centric. It believes that market competition and self-interested individuals will act to grow the economy endlessly. It's utterly out of step with the realities and the crises of our times. And so we need to start again. So I study economics, and I'll show you briefly. I replace these diagrams for a 21st century economics. We need to recognize that we have an economy that is embedded in society, embedded in the living world. The economy is a subset of the living world and therefore needs to be aligned with the systems of life. That the portrait of humanity, we might need to recognize ourselves as part of a web of life, dependent upon all other living creatures, and with a stewardship responsibility to all. And that the goal is not endless growth. The goal must be to thrive. And this is the donut, where we meet the needs of all people within the means of the living planet. So that's a very, very quick overview of the shift from the 20th to the 21st century mindset. And I believe it is fundamentally crucial to change the way that we design and operate our economies in the future.
Thank you so much, Kate. That's very clear. Why is it that in the 20th century or traditional economics, why is it that the starting point is the supply and demand, and the objective is endless material growth, which is a myth, is impossible? How do we get here?
It's a very powerful question. Every subject is subjective in its worldview, in its starting point, on what we put our attention on, because we have to make a choice as human beings, what we focus on and what we put to the sidelines. So it's not objective and a scientific truth. It's a choice of where to focus our attention. And economics has evolved without paying attention to the living planet. And perhaps the reason is because back in the day of Adam Smith, 300 years ago, the impact of humanity was relatively small compared to the size of the planet. So we could cut woods and cut timber and take fish from the sea and start burning some fossil fuels when we discovered them, imagining that we would never really disrupt the bigger systems of which we are a part. So economics began putting the living world outside, beyond its scope. But the scale of human impact, the anthropocentric and Anthropocene today, shows that we actually have huge impacts on the living world. And we have to start by recognizing that we are a subset and a subsystem of life. So we need to rewrite our economics to keep up with the times. And I think it starts with the market-centric thinking, because it's a very compelling tool of analysis, because markets are prevalent. It puts market interests first. So I think there's a political interest behind it as well. Even though economics professors don't think that they're teaching in a political way, I think it is political to start with the market rather than start with the big picture of the goal and ask what are the many different ways we can provision to meet our needs and wants. And the strongest way to counter it is to show an alternative possibility. And which I find the students I teach and have been teaching for a decade find it so compelling and find it makes sense to start with this much bigger picture. And then they look back at the old textbooks and say, why is most of what really truly matters missing from this picture? So I think sometimes the best form of protest is to propose something new. And that's why donut economics is a very positive proposition. I'm not interested in endlessly critiquing the neoliberal mindset. I want to propose an alternative to show that there's just a different way of thinking and doing that's possible.
Maybe that's one of the reasons for which you received the Pope's praise, because in Laudato Si, the Pope also questions the anthropocentric view of Christianity, and he says the idea that comes from the book of Genesis, which is the first book of the Bible, that humans are masters of the universe at any cost and we are the center of the world, is totally wrong. We are here to care for this beautiful creation that God has entrusted to us. So even he's changing, he's moving from a total anthropocentric view, still centering in humanity, because if we have a special dignity, but in a more relational way, which includes nature. And maybe that's a connection with theology, with your view. But I would like to quote another economist, which is Schumacher. It's an old book, no, from 1973. But he says, I was wondering, what do you think, Kate? He says that the rising error of economics is closely connected with the philosophical, not to say religious, changes during the last 3 or 4 centuries in man's attitude to nature. Modern man does not experience himself as part of nature, but as an outside force destined to dominate and conquer it. This is not Pope Francis, this is Schumacher. Is it similar to what you are trying to tell us about the problem with Homo economicus being at the center?
I think it's very connected. And I think I agree very much with Schumacher. If we look back hundreds of years to the Enlightenment thinking, which brought an incredible scientific revolution, but came along with it a separation of humans from the rest of nature. If we think of Francis Bacon, who was an incredibly influential character in the 16th century, saying, you know, let man reclaim his rightful dominion over nature. Let us tear from her secrets, torture her to discover her secrets. I mean, it's an extraordinary, violent separation of humanity from nature. And for many countries and individuals, it seems to have succeeded, right? The exploitation of Earth's resources and energy sources and materials, but of course, at great cost. Now it becomes clear to the living world. The creature of economic man at the heart of economic theory is like the epitome of that, because it not only separates humans from the rest of the living world and turns nature into resources instead of relations, but it also separates humans one from another. So it creates the individual. And I think it was modeled on Newtonian physics, right? The economists of the 1870s saw Newtonian physics and that Newton had modeled the world from the whole down to one atom. And if he took one atom, then he could model that atom and understand everything. So by analogy, let's reduce society to one individual. If we can model that individual, then we can aggregate. Will we be able to understand everything? But this atom that was created, first, we are not individual. No human can survive if they are born and raised alone. We are the most pro-social of all animals. So we are not isolated individuals. We're profoundly interdependent, pro-social creatures. We depend upon our relationships. We are reciprocal. We are caring. We are altruistic. This is as much a part of our human nature as self-interest. And indeed, many philosophers have recognized the push-pull of these different human traits. So how do we nurture the best of human nature? If we tell ourselves we are self-interested, competitive, and by the way, everybody else is, then when you go out into the world, you expect that everybody else will be competitive and self-interested. It brings out that side of us. I need to defend myself. They're going to attack me. They're going to try to cheat me. So it's a self-reinforcing effect. We need to understand real human psychology and look at successful human societies and see the prosociality, see our interdependence, and again, recognize that we're not dominant over nature. We are deeply dependent upon nature.
That resonates with Christian anthropology, which is essentially relational.
Right.
We are, of course, we are individuals, we are persons, but we are persons in relation. If you either forget completely the individual dignity, you get very easily into totalitarianism.
Yes.
Equally, if you forget the relational part, the social aspect, you get into individualism, and maybe economics is driven by this extreme individualism.
I think it is.
Why don't you explain it with your graphics that is better than words?
Well, no, the words are wonderful. I think 20th century economics that placed this model of humanity, of rational economic man at its heart, has been extremely problematic because it has so profoundly influenced us in return. So we need to move away from this model of rational economic man. Say goodbye. You no longer serve our times. We need to move from thinking of ourselves as self-interested, me and my ego, towards recognizing that we are pro-social. The we of humanity is very, very strong. We are not isolated individuals. We cannot survive that way. We are profoundly interdependent for care, for community, for love, for recognition, for dignity, for providing for our wants and needs. We are not rational, like calculating machines. We are heuristic, which means we follow the rule of thumb. We are approximating, and we do not have fixed preferences. We are influenced with fluid values. Young people follow fashions. We are influenced by those around us. We can trigger competitive values, or we can trigger collaborative values. So we all have within us this capacity to exhibit very different kinds of values, and they can be triggered by the economy around us, by the society around us. And then lastly, we're not dominant over nature, seeing the rest of nature like resources for humanity's use and exploitation. We are deeply dependent upon nature, embedded in the web of life, and therefore have a strong obligation of stewardship and care, because we can be so influential upon the lives of all other living beings on this planet. So for me, these are 5 key shifts we need to recognize. And let's just remember that rational economic man was a theoretical invention. He was invented by economists who wanted a model that could be mathematically calculated. He fit into their equations. The social adaptable human is empirically what we are learning about ourselves, not from economists, but from psychologists, from sociologists, from anthropologists, from behavioral scientists. They actually observed how humans behave, and there is a very different, much richer, more beautiful person there. So let's make sure that we put that vision of ourselves at the heart of our economics and nurture the best of human nature so that we can thrive, many of us together on this living planet.
Thank you, Kate. That reminds me a person that we both admire, Amartya Sen. I remember Amartya Sen telling me that this rational maximizer is actually a rational fool. Another English guy, Robert Skidelsky, who recently wrote a book on what's wrong with economics. And he said, in the mind of the economist, there is a picture of the human being as a utility maximizer, like you describe it. So the key for human behavior is this kind of maximizing utility and diminishing risks at any cost. And this conception of Homo economicus underpins, he says, their policy advice. But unfortunately, this picture of individual is promoting all the political economic advice that we are all receiving. This is very powerful. Your picture is quite funny. I mean, it's like, who is this guy? Let's get rid of it. But he's very, very embedded into the current political economic of the world. Is there any chance that we can really get rid of the Homo economicus in the actual world?
In the actual world, well, I think we've created institutions and organizations that invite Homo economicus to come to work. When we design companies that are focused on profit maximizing and delivering the highest dividends to their shareholders or their private owners, quarter on quarter, the pressure, the hierarchies in companies, this invites those traits of humanity that are most like Homo economicus. And yet many people describe having terrible working lives in companies like that. And they often will say, I can't bring all of my values to work. I leave my family, right? You leave your family in the morning, you with your children, with your partner. Very different values are at work. Very different values are in operation at home. Then come to work, leave that behind, and be much more like rational economic man. So it literally creates a separation in the individual. Many of the workshops that I do with people who work in companies, when I talk to them about donut economics, about the vision of living within the living world, a regenerative future, a distributive future, people feel really uncomfortable inside. And I often reassure them and I say, look, if you're feeling a pain inside, it's because of the tension between your true values and what you understand here and the values and the behaviors that you are asked to show at work because of the design of the companies that we're in. So I think we need to redesign businesses and organizations and politics, how we debate in parliaments, how we recruit and promote people, how we say a company is doing well. The deep designs need to be changed so that we can be human.
That's a compelling answer because you're mentioning here in Argentina we have a problem that every time we talk about alternative economics, to most people it sounds like too lefty, and this is closer to Venezuela, and people wants to get out of the country, inflation, corruption, more poverty. But what you're saying is that while at the same time we try to change the mindset of our economic policies, we need to change actually our businesses models. What would you say to business people? I mean, is it possible to apply donuts economics in a company?
Absolutely. Before we dive into the business world, can I just show this diagram? This for me is the big picture of the economy, right? Let's recognize that the economy is a subsystem of society. It is a human construct. We have entirely invented our economies. They are made by human beings, and they're brilliant and ingenious and also damaging, and we need to change them. But a human society is embedded in the living world. We are part of nature. So we need economies that work for society and are aligned with the living world. Let's recognize that we're drawing in materials and matter and putting out waste and pollution back into the world. We are bathed in a river of solar energy. We need to make sure our economies are aligned with life. And then let's look inside that economy. There are many different ways that we provision for our fundamental needs and wants, right? So through the market, which is where mainstream economics starts, private goods and services, these are produced and sold through price-based exchange. That's what a market relationship is. I sell something or I buy something. We also provision for our needs and wants through the commons, co-created goods and services that are produced by and for members of the commons, like Wikipedia, like shared community spaces, like a community festival. It's created and stewarded by people collectively. We also produce through the household, core goods and services, members of our own families, care, raising our children, caring for our partners, caring for our parents. This work is traditionally and typically performed by women, but it's being more equally distributed today. And then provisioned by the state, public goods and services produced by the state for the resident population. So these are 4 ways through the market, the state, the household, and the commons. I would not want to live in a society that missed any one of these, because I think each of them has unique qualities and attributes, but they work best when they work together. And the state has a special responsibility to protect the space for the household, to protect the space for the commons, and to regulate the market so that it can be really effective, but not destructive to the rest of the spaces. Let's just recognize that we can produce food in all of these ways, through the household, through the market, through the state, or the commons. We can produce energy in all of these ways. So there are many, many different ways of operating. And let me dive now into what you're asking me about, the world of business. So companies.
Can I interrupt you?
Yes, of course.
No, just because it reminds me, Pope Francis mentioned something about the idolatry of the market, when the market becomes an idol. So in your diagram, it leaves out the households, the commons, the state, and it rules rather than serve. No?
Yes, and it also can create negative impacts on society, and of course on the living world. So it draws resources and it creates pollution, and the market gets out of scale to the rest of the thing. This again is why, for me, we can't start economics saying here's supply and demand, this is the market, and looking at it in abstract. We have to look at it in relation to the rest. It needs to be used in the right sectors, but not in others. We ban child labor, for example, right? There are places where markets are not permitted, and for very good reason. But we also need to protect other values from excessive use of the market.
So I'm very keen on these ideas, but would you convince business people?
So many companies have connected with us at Donut Economics Action Lab, saying we want to, either they say we're a startup, we are a really socially and environmentally motivated company. The donut looks like our logo. This is why we're in business. Or some very big companies that have a history of very damaging impact socially and ecologically in the world, saying, okay, how could we transform? And with all of them, we say, look, we don't want to talk with you about the design of your products. We want to talk about the design of the company itself. because the deep design of your company is ultimately going to determine what you can be and do in the world. So let me show you the deep design of a company. I think of 5 design traits, and I invite you and anybody listening to think of a company that you know, one that you love or one that you really don't like, one that you work for, one you've left or joined or started. Think of a company and ask yourself about these 5 design traits of the company. So first, what is its purpose? Why does this company even exist in the world? What's it actually in service of in the world? What are its networks of relationships? So all the relationships with the employees, with the customers, with suppliers, with the industry allies or competitors, relationships with government. Is the company living out its true values through these relationships, or actually having quite exploitative relationships? How is this company governed? Who's in the room when decisions get made? What are the metrics by which success is judged? Going deeper, we get to more profound issues. How is the company owned? Is it owned by its founder, an entrepreneur? Is it owned by shareholders, by venture capital? Is it owned by a family for 300 years? Is it owned by the state? Is it owned by its customers or its employees? All of these are existing models of ownership of a company, and they're really powerfully shape everything else, how it's owned, and particularly how it's financed. Where is the money that finances this company coming from? Is it coming from sales? Is it coming from debt or from share issue? Is it coming from venture capital? Because where that finance is coming from is going to profoundly determine what that finance expects and what it extracts for the owners of the company and what it reinvests in the purpose. So to put it very simply, we can probably all think of some companies that are really driven by generating maximal financial returns for the owners. And these are often shareholder owned or privately owned, and they can operate in a very exploitative way, paying below minimum wages, paying poverty wages, exploiting the living world to maximize returns. So everything else is in service of driving maximum returns to the owners. We can probably all think of companies too, in which the ownership, the governance, and the financing and the relationships are all structured towards their purpose. This company exists to improve the world.
Do you know actual companies that?
Yes, I do. I could think of companies that have been set up by people who've, with conviction, and they're often still held by individuals who are driving it with their conviction, but they've designed it to give away 50% of their profits. Or, for example, Tony's Chocolonely, a company in the Netherlands, was founded, their chocolate making company. Their purpose is for chocolate worldwide to be 100% free of slave labor. So their purpose is much bigger than their own company. It's to transform the world of chocolate, not just we want to be the biggest chocolate making company in Europe, or no, we want to get slavery out of chocolate, and we're going to set up a company because that's our goal. Or Fairphone, which is a company in the Netherlands that makes mobile phones, but they want to make them fair, paying decent wages without, again, slavery and exploitation in the supply chains. They set up a company to bring about change. So they have to design themselves to make sure that they can remain true to their purpose. It's not easy because, of course, the major business and financial world are all focused on maximizing returns to the owners, to the shareholders or the investors. So you're sailing into the wind, right? You're going against the norm, but you're demonstrating that a different kind of business is possible.
And when you mention these purpose-driven companies, are the NGOs and non-profit companies also in this position? Because you can be also a schizophrenic NGO. You mentioned kind of schizophrenia in people that that we are wonderful, we are collaborative, but then business is business, and we are individual and extractive. But don't you think that also NGOs, universities can be likewise? We can have a very good purpose, but then when we manage our own finances, we are driven by this super extractive, absolutely profit at any cost business. Even in Catholic universities could happen. Most people work in Catholic universities here, but it could happen to any NGO. Have you encountered any shift in these non-profit companies as well?
So I wouldn't call them non-profit companies, maybe non-profit organizations. Because for me, a company is a profit-based organization. So, but you're talking, I think it's a really great question. This these 5 design traits can, of course, be applied to any organization, to a university, to an NGO, a charity, to a local council, because we all have a purpose. We have networks of relationship. We have rules of how we're governed. We have some form of ownership, and there's finance. So actually, it's a really good exercise for anybody, a university team, to sit down and say, actually, let's look at the deep design of our own university. Where's the tension? Let's recognize there's going to be tension. Often because of the way we're financed, is it in tension with our true purpose? So how are we going to make sure that we don't get hijacked by the demands of finance that is actually corrupting our purpose? How are we going to make sure, particularly, that we're owned and governed in ways that allow us to stay true to this purpose? So I think it's crucial, whether we're talking about for-profit companies or other organizations like universities, like museums, like councils, like a foundation or a charity. We can all look at the deep design of our institutions and then recognize that how we're designed really influences the human being who comes to work. Can I come to work altruistic, collaborative, wanting to work together with other organizations? Or is the design of our organization making me come to work self-interested for my own promotion? Is it making me come to work highly competitive, that we must beat our competitors? So the design of organizations shapes the permission for different kinds of human behaviors. So it's crucial in enabling us to be fully human in the world of work.
And this allows me to ask you something about yourself, if you don't mind. How did you get to these ideas? Because you were studying economics, and then you wanted to change the world, or to increase your and earning money, I guess. Or is there any personal experience or educational experience or work experience that has triggered your imagination towards the donut?
So I went to university in the 1990s. I was raised as a teenager in a middle-class household in the UK, so a privileged position in the world to start with. I understood the world from what I saw on the television news. So I saw a famine in Ethiopia in the mid-1980s. I saw a hole opening up in the ozone layer. This was on the news. They talked about the greenhouse effect and the beginnings of climate change. And I thought, I want to help solve these problems in the world. This was my motivation. So I'm going to study economics because it's going to give me the language and the concepts of public policy making. And I was a very enthusiastic student because I wanted to understand everything. And it was only towards the end of my studies that I realized so much was missing from what we'd talked about. We'd never really talked about power. We'd never talked about gender or race or class. We'd never really talked about the living world that wasn't even possible to study. And after I finished my degree, I did a master's degree actually in development economics, where I really did learn the work of Amartya Sen, which made a lot more sense to me. And I thought, this should be all economics. Why is it called development economics? This is just economic. But it made a lot more sense to me. And then I worked for 3 years in Zanzibar, which is an island of Tanzania. And there I was immersed in working with barefoot entrepreneurs, particularly women living in a village who had nothing to rely on except their community and the forest. They had to collect water every day. They made handicraft. I learned Swahili, and I worked alongside them and was so profoundly impacted by seeing people who economic systems really hadn't served at all, and how they managed and how they survived and how they had a relationship to the forest and a relationship in their community. And that was a profoundly humbling experience for me. I then worked for 4 years at the United Nations Development Programme. They produce a report every year called the Human Development Report. And that really helped me because it was a response, again, created by Amartya Sen and Mahbub al-Haq. They wrote the Human Development Report as a response to the World Bank's World Development Report, which is about economics. Which country is economically the strongest? And the Human Development Report said, no, which country does best for human development, for health, for education, and for the means of living for people. So it put people at the center. And this was a really important part of steering me towards a human-centric economics. But I was always aware that in the Human Development Index, which ranks the world's countries, the countries at the top in those years, they were Norway, Canada, Australia, And I had to do radio interviews with those countries to say, congratulations, Norway or Australia, you're at the top of the Human Development Index. But I was thinking, but these countries are carbon intensive. They use a lot of resources. We're not measuring that. We're not talking about the living world. So always the living world was missing for me. I came back to the UK. I worked for Oxfam for many years. We campaigned on climate change and recognizing how climate change is intricately affecting the lives of vulnerable and marginalized communities worldwide, and the responsibility of high-income countries. And then I had children and I had twins. And so I was immersed for a year myself in the unpaid caring economy, the household economy. And I really understood the gendered relationships and the importance of unpaid caring work and the tension with paid work. And then there was a global financial crisis. And I was sitting there with two babies on my lap, watching the world's financial system crumble. And the economists then came out because the Queen of England said, why didn't the economists see this coming? And the economists all scrambled to answer her question. And they said, we must rewrite economics so that it reflects financial realities. And I remember sitting there with these babies, having campaigned on climate change, having lived in Zanzibar, and thinking, there's no way we can rewrite economics only to reflect financial realities. We must reflect ecological realities. We must reflect social realities. This is a moment for rewriting economics. And it led me then to draw the donut diagram to say, come on, we need an actual positive vision and a picture of what we are for, because it's not just endless growth and it's not just market efficiency. So then I drew the donut and I was amazed by the number of people who really responded positively to it. And I realized the power of pictures and the power of a positive propositional vision. And that's what led me to write Donut Economics.
So how did you get to the donut, to the idea?
Yeah. So how I got to the idea was because when I came back from maternity leave, back to my job at Oxfam, one of my colleagues said, here are some of the big ideas that have influenced the world while you've been away having babies. And the one that stuck with me was this. This is a diagram of planetary boundaries. And it was published in 2009 by Earth system scientists, including Johan Rockstrom and Will Steffen and about 28 others. They said this green space here, this is the safe operating space for humanity. We need to keep humanity's pressure on the planet within this space. That's the space for our economy. But we are already in overshoot. Look, on climate change, on excessive fertilizer use, on biodiversity loss. So we are in overshoot. And I saw this picture and I had such a strong response at my desk. I thought this is the beginning of the 21st century economics, because scientists have said to economists, if you won't recognize that we depend upon the living world, if you're just going to call it an externality, we're going to do the job for you. Here it is. We've done it. This is the space, the maximum space of the economy, but we are already overshooting it. We need to come back within these planetary boundaries. So sitting at my desk, I thought, this is the beginning. But I worked for Oxfam. I worked for a social justice organization. I had spent my focus on poverty. So I thought, if there's an outer limit to the planet, there's also an inner limit, which we call human rights. And we need to draw that in too. And that's why I drew the diagram of the donut. So this is the donut, right? The outer limits are the planetary boundaries recognized by those Earth system scientists. Do not go beyond that the ecological ceiling. But we also must make sure that nobody in the world is falling short on the essentials of life. Nobody is in the hole in the middle of the donut without the resources they need for health and education and food and housing, transport, for dignity, for equity, for gender equality. So you put those two circles together and people said to me, somebody said to me, oh, it looks like a donut. The diagram isn't a circle, it's a donut. So I didn't come up with a name. Now it's a playful, it's a silly name. Like you say, it sounds like the opposite of what we want. What I learned though, in calling it the donut, is that many, many people are intimidated by economics. It's scary. It sounds mathematical. It sounds very technical. And I can't do it. It's got nothing to do with me. I'm not expert enough. But when you put the word donut in front of economics, people think, this is an invitation. This is playful. This is accessible. I'm not going to be intimidated. And so they come and play with it. So I've played with the playful side of donut economics, making it very accessible. And I think that's a political act. We need to make sure that everybody understands they can be part of the economic conversation, because we all shape the economy and it definitely shapes all of our lives.
That's excellent for our audience, that they think that economics is only for experts. And also it resonates pretty much with what Amartya Sen described when he explains the history of economics, that he said actually good economists, they have always merged the economic or engineering side of economics and the ethical side.
Yes.
And I guess this is what you're trying to do. But I have a question. And how do we measure then economic growth or the thriving that you mentioned? How, because if there's no measure at all, how can we know that we are not overshooting the planetary limits, or we are doing quite well in respecting the social basis? If we don't have metrics, or people manipulate metrics, we don't have the wrong economic policies.
So first of all, we absolutely can measure, right? And we can measure actually in far more useful detail than the GDP of a country. And here I'm showing you the quantified global donut. So this is the state of the world. We are overshooting multiple planetary boundaries, and billions of human beings are falling short on the essentials of life. That social shortfall, if you see the one for food, that red wedge for food goes 11% of the way towards the center of the circle, because 11% of people worldwide do not have enough food to eat every day. So we want to eliminate all of the red shortfall, push it back to the social foundation, but simultaneously come back within planetary boundaries. So we're trying to come into the donut from both sides at the same time. And let's just recognize that 20th century economics wasn't invented for this. This was not their problem. They didn't see this picture. So we should never expect that last century's theories or government policies or business models or lifestyle aspirations were going to help solve this challenge. This is a challenge for our times. We are the first generation to see this two-sided challenge. And so we need new theories, but also new policies, new business designs, new lifestyle aspirations, new kinds of social movements that we take account of the social and ecological. We can't just work on one or the other. So this is the global picture. But let me bring it down to the national level. A colleague of mine has created, together with his research allies, 150 national donuts. So here's just 4 of 150, crossing the whole spectrum. So you can see, for example, Malawi, with around $1,500 per person per year, has a lot of social shortfall. There's a lot of red in the middle of that hole, without overshooting their share of any of the planetary boundaries. We've got Argentina, with some social shortfall, but significant ecological overshoot. And the biggest ecological overshoots are on phosphorus and nitrogen. That's fertilizer. That's going into animal feed. And that's the agricultural meat production. I think that's what would explain such strong fertilizer overshoot, but also overshoot on other planetary boundaries. You've got Denmark, which isn't falling short on any of those social foundations when compared to the rest of the world. So Denmark is doing well socially, but is overshooting many planetary boundaries. And then the United States, even more income, they've got high inequality. You can see that in the center, and really significant ecological overshoot. There's no country in the world that's currently living in the donut. There's one country that's closer than any other, and that's Costa Rica, closer to meeting the needs of all people, nearly within the means of the planet. And this should give us hope that it could be possible. Now, let me go from these 4 to over 50 illustrative nations. The place where every country should be aiming to be is in that top left-hand corner where there's a green donut, because that is where we've risen up to meet the needs of all people, but done it coming back within the means of the planet at the same time. So here's Argentina. And let's recognize first that these countries don't stand separate and independent. They are profoundly connected, from histories of colonialism all the way through to the current and future impacts of climate change. So we need to change relationships between them. Now, the history of pursuing GDP growth has generally taken countries in this direction. When you're like Malawi, to double your national income from $1,500 to $3,000 per person can be transformative. It takes you up. It meets human needs. People have food and water. Kids go to school. There is healthcare. It's really positive. But instead of transforming all additional income into humans thriving within planetary boundaries, the vast majority of countries go straight past that spot and they overshoot. They go right into ecological overshoot. So we need a different pathway. Just pursuing growth does not take us to the donut. What if the future of prosperity could instead recluster countries? These low-income countries need to rise so that they meet the needs of all people within the means of the planet without overshooting like all before them have done. How will they do that? We don't yet know because it's new. It's unprecedented. Middle-income countries need to reorient. They need to meet the needs of their people while coming back within planetary boundaries. This too is unprecedented. And high-income countries like where I am, like the US, Canada, Australia, and all European countries need to massively reduce their impact on planetary boundaries while finally meeting the needs of all of their people. And lastly, this is going to call for a rebalancing between nations, right? An international rebalancing. High-income countries recognizing their historic contribution to the challenges, ecological challenges. It's going to call for reparations, for redistribution of wealth, for redistribution of technology, for rebalancing power in international institutions. So for me, this is the map of the directionality we need for the future. And I would judge any country's policies, from local policies to negotiations at the United Nations, in terms of, is it helping us to move in these directions? Because if it's not helping us move in these directions, it's not taking us towards the donut.
Thank you for this. I like the idea of ascender, reducir, orientar para reequilibrar. Most people here, and they have a strong argument. They would say, well, we need to grow because we have 50% of our population living in poverty. We need infrastructure, we need better schools, better hospitals, we need better education, we need to create jobs because we have a lot of people unemployed at the moment, and the state cannot sustain. The majority of the working force of the country is not working. The country will collapse. So most people would say, why is Europe or the developed countries or the rich countries or high-income countries telling us what to do? Because they have polluted everything. They have already grown. They have, well, other problems, but we have these very striking problems that we need to solve. And for that, we need to continue working on agriculture. We need to continue working on mining, on extracting gas and oil and export it. And we need to continue to produce meat, etc. And I'm not saying they would say this because they don't care about the planetary boundaries, but they do care about the social basis, and they know the power games that we play globally. So people would say, we're always last, and we would like to grow, and once we grow, we will take care of the planetary boundaries. What would you say to this, to people who are inclined to this thinking?
Important questions. And I want to recognize that Argentina has been suffering extremely high economic crises and is been in a very vulnerable, urgent situation. However, this diagram does not say you cannot grow. There's nothing here that says you cannot have a growing economy, because the economy is not the metric here. There are two major metrics here. One is, are you meeting the needs of all people? That's the main point you just made. You said 50% of people are living in poverty. This diagram focuses on that. You need to rise up so that nobody is left falling short. But also, this diagram says the future direction of your economy means we all need to come back and take action to come back within planetary boundaries. Now, it's very clear from this diagram that the United States, Canada, and Australia have the biggest responsibility to move furthest and fastest because they are the biggest overshooters. But all countries that are overshooting need to transform the future direction, because we all have a responsibility. And actually, you said just now, Argentina or others might say we are last. I'm going to disagree with that. Look at sub-Saharan Africa. Look at the extent of poverty there. So we don't need to compete to say who is worst off. If we want our economy to develop, it needs to develop in a way that meets the needs of all people. This is going to call for redistribution, because actually within every country, there are also some very wealthy people. So we need to redistribute. We need to build new infrastructure, but we need to build infrastructure that serves all. So we need to be far more distributive by design. We need agriculture. But we cannot carry on practicing agriculture that is destroying the landscape, that is creating a lot of fertilizer overload. So yes, practice agriculture, but how do we make this agriculture regenerative so that we repair the soils and so that it protects biodiversity instead of destroying it? Yes, you may say we need mining. How could mining become a far more ecologically sensitive and regenerative industry, an urgent requirement? And then on oil and gas, we need urgently to move away from thinking that oil and gas is a resource to burn. It's an incredibly wasteful use of a very precious resource, most of which should be kept in the ground. We need to move to regenerative forms of energy. But this is why I have the rebalancing arrow as well, because the high-income countries that have benefited so much from very polluting industry have a responsibility to move first and fastest and to make it possible for other countries to move in this direction. So this diagram does not say economies cannot grow. It says, as you seek growth or as you seek economic development, how can we make sure it's distributive and meets the needs of all people? And how can we make it regenerative?
I like the word regenerative. It's about an idea that everything that we produce, trade, consume, it can be used to another thing. No?
Yes. Can I show you briefly?
Yeah, of course.
So if we're going to transform the future, we need to change these two major dynamics. We need to go from a degenerative linear system where we take Earth's materials, make them into things we want, use it for a while and throw it away. We need to move towards a cyclical regenerative economy so that we regenerate the cycles of life, so that we live within the cycles of the living world. So from examples, in landscapes, we need to stop degrading and chopping down and denuding landscape and instead regenerate Earth. And nature is incredibly generous to us. She comes back when we give her the chance. But also beyond landscapes, in industries, we need to stop throwing our waste in the neighborhoods of the world's poorest people and instead create a circular economy upstream where we repair and reuse and refurbish and recognize that every material has a future life. So how can we respect the value of that material? So from degenerative to regenerative, but also we've inherited economies that tend to be divisive by design. They capture opportunity and value in the hands of few people. This leads to the rise of a 1% in a nation and globally. There is absolutely no way we can thrive as humanity in such an unequal world as we have created now. We need to create far more distributive economic systems where value and opportunity are shared far more equitably with everybody who co-creates it. I'll show you a couple of examples. I think of housing. In London, the city I grew up in, housing is treated like an investment asset purchased by people with so much money that they just want a return on additional assets, so I'll buy a house. It makes it completely unaffordable for young generation who can't even begin to own their own homes. Contrast that with the city of Vienna, where social housing is owned by the city and cooperatives. It's central, it's affordable, it's normal, it's good quality, because the city made a decision 100 years ago that housing is not an investment asset, it's a human right. And so we will own the city's housing in respect of it being a human right. Again, the deep design of the city. But also in Argentina, my favorite example of Alejandro Aravena, this incredible architect who realized that many people could afford to buy just half a house. So he started designing half houses that somebody could afford, and then they would build and fill in the rest. And by doing this change of architectural design, he's opened up possibility of housing ownership to many, many more people. So this is a distributive design of housing. And then let's just come back to what we were talking about before, business. We can have a deeply divisive design of business that hires people in a sweatshop style, pays them poverty wages, exploits their labor, and makes a lot of profit from them. Or businesses in the very same sector can be owned by the workers, as this company in Mumbai. The workers are holding up a sign saying, I own my fashion factory. It's owned by the women who work there. They receive the profits that they make collectively. It's a different design of business. It's far more distributive. So I believe that if we're going to come into this space where we meet the needs of all people within the means of the planet, it's only going to be if we create a far more regenerative and distributive economic system in every country. And of course, it's going to look different in every country because we're each at our own stage. The high-income countries have the biggest responsibility to transform deepest and fastest, but every country needs to start getting on this trajectory, whether it's Argentina or Malawi or the United States or Denmark or the UK. We all need to transform.
But if we all need to transform, and each country in a particular way, we need to participate in this transformation. Am I right?
Yes.
A question clarification, it would be very good for our audience if you can explain, if we are going to get involved in this regenerative economy, and push our businesses and our companies and our organizations and countries towards a new economy, maybe we need to understand something that is every day on every single paper in the world, I would say, but that is the gross domestic product, or GDP, or national income. Maybe if you can explain to non-economic people why this metric or this measure was useful, maybe could be useful, but is certainly not enough for the 21st century.
So GDP, gross domestic product, measures the economic value of goods and services that are produced and sold in a country in a year. So it tells us something useful. What's the value of everything that's been produced and sold in this country in a year? Of course, that's relevant. Of course, that matters. But it misses out a lot too. In fact, the creator of this metric, an economist called Simon Kuznets, back in the 1930s, he was asked by the US Congress to come up with one number to measure the US economy. He did, and it's what we call GDP. He also gave the caveat because he recognized that it doesn't reflect everything that matters. It tells us, for example, the value of timber when we chop down a forest. It doesn't tell you the lost value of the biodiversity of that forest, its capacity to hold water, its capacity to create medicines, its capacity to house biodiversity, to create new seeds and crops that we haven't yet discovered. So it doesn't tell us what we've lost. It only tells us what we've sold. It also doesn't tell us anything about the unpaid caring work. When I'm at home raising my children, that doesn't show up in GDP. If I leave my children and go and raise somebody else's children and they pay me, that will show up in GDP. So it ignores unpaid caring work, which is essential for life, for human connection, for love. It ignores the commons. So Wikipedia doesn't show up in GDP, even though it's an incredibly valuable resource that many people use. And it also ignores the damage that's done. It ignores climate breakdown. GDP ignores ecological breakdown. It ignores droughts. It ignores oil spills. In fact, it counts an oil spill as a very active cleanup effect. So it counts the number of people who are employed to clean up after an oil spill, but it doesn't recognize the damage of the oil spill.
Or even
Yes,
problems with health.
That's right. GDP goes up when people are in hospital being treated, or when people are in prison being locked in. This contributes to GDP. So instead of using the amount of money that's bought and sold, we need different metrics. I sometimes give the example, if my children held a sale outside my house, we gathered everything that we didn't want anymore, and my kids are selling it on the doorstep, a yard sale. And I go out and I come back and they say, Mom, we made $100. I say, wow, that's amazing. How? And they say, oh, we sold the family dog. It's like, what? But there are some things you can't sell, right? And we find it funny because we implicitly know there are some things that should not be in the market. You can't just put them in. It goes back to the market, the state, the household, and the commons. You don't put in the market the household and the commons. There are reasons why the state provides healthcare, provides education, to make it accessible to all. Because markets are very powerful, but there's two big problems. They only serve those who can pay. Everybody else they ignore. And they only value what's priced. Everything else they tend to exploit. And those are massive drawbacks of markets. That's why we need other provisioning systems. But GDP is also a very thin way of measuring a nation's success. If you tell me the UK economy has grown by 1.2% over the last year, I mean, is that good? I don't know. Maybe there was a pandemic and we had to provide everybody with vaccines, or there was an oil spill and we cleaned it up. It tells us so little. If we use the donut instead, right? If we take a donut for the UK, the crucial questions, are we getting people out of deprivation or not? So we focus on the worst off. Are they getting out of deprivation or not? Are we coming back within the means of the planet or not? This, to me, is the fundamental metric and direction that we need for 21st century economics. So GDP just tells you how much has been bought and sold. It's useful for the tax collector. It's useful for forecasting if you care about economic values. Yes, it's useful, but it doesn't tell us about our success, about our thriving, about our prosperity. So for this, we need far more diverse metrics.
I'm more concerned of participation and involvement in changing economics. No? And if we talk about GDP, most people will get, well, I don't know, what is GDP? I mean, I have no idea what the nation. But if you say all what you're saying, it's about my values. And people can relate to values. And don't you think that getting a bit rid of the homo economicus towards a picture of a person that is more real, relational, and a different kind of metrics, don't you think that people will get more involved in the change that economic needs?
Absolutely. And I've learned this by experience. So my book, Donut Economics, 7 Ways to Think Like a 21st Century Economist, came out in 2017. And since then, I was contacted by people who said, I love the ideas and I want to do it. I am doing it. So let me show you. It's been an amazing 5 years, 5 to 7 years of people saying, we want to measure our economy differently with data and indicators. We want to use this to transform our city. We want to use this in our business. We're going to use it in our community. We want to teach it in schools. So all over the world, people are welcome to join our community, donuteconomics.org. You can see there are people who've joined, there are organizations, companies, cities. And if anybody watching this is interested, you can see the playfulness, right? This is what happens when you call economics donut economics. People just get playful. They know they can bring the whole conversation. Nobody feels intimidated by this. And we have a platform called donuteconomics.org. We invite people to use our tools that we've put in the commons. They're translated into multiple languages, including in Spanish. You could use them. We ask only that you share back your learnings. We are committed to creating a 21st century commons. And so our own experiment with our work is part of doing that.
That sounds brilliant. We should have a donut in Argentina or in one of the cities, maybe. Most people in our audience is interested on justice, no? And is it not true that to get from one type of economics, the 20th century of economics, to the 21st century, well, it's not true that we need money, because there will be trade-offs. And where is the money going to come from? How are we going to shift the economic model or to promote a just transition without affecting the very poor or the poorest countries?
Well, I think that the focus of the donut is to say, first of all, we need to focus on the very poor. These are the people without their most basic needs met. So the donut follows the work of Amartya Sen in talking about human capabilities. Everybody needs these resources to have a capability to lead a dignified life. So this is where our focus should be. Poor people within every country, but also the lower income countries themselves. That's why in that map I showed, we need to rebalance between nations. I know it's much easier for me to say that. I can't say how we're going to transform it. This becomes geopolitics. But I do know, I believe that by showing a different vision, by showing where different countries are, we tell a very different story than saying which country is richer than which one. And that the idea of development means just to increase your GDP to be more like those high income countries.
Sure.
To show the responsibility ecologically, to show the shortfalls socially, to recognize these problems exist in every country, to recognize that every country needs to transform in a way that we haven't been before. This is an uncharted pathway. So it calls for humility and ambition from every country. How do we redistribute? And how do we make it possible for the poorest people to get out of this situation?
Exactly. Which takes me to my final question. That is, what is the role of religions in your view, if any, and particularly Christianity?
I think religions play a hugely valuable role because religion begins with values. It's the opposite to economics. Economics begins with supply and demand. And in fact, values are almost pushed to the side because that's not scientific or that's not objective. whereas religions are founded upon values of our respect and treatment for each other and our relation to the rest of the living world. And so it centers care. Religion centers dignity and love and reciprocity. And it's the opposite of be competitive, be self-interested. I think religion, the values of religions nurture that side of human nature that we really need to amplify. I'm not somebody, I haven't been raised and I don't hold a religious worldview, but I profoundly see the value of community, of your church community, and the trust and love that exists between people who know they have shared values and shared community. And religion beautifully exemplifies that. So I think the religions of the world have a hugely important value. And I'm really honored every time people from different religious communities have contacted me and said, of all the economics we've seen, this aligns much more closely with the values that we hold at the heart of our religion. And that's why I'm really delighted to be joining you today and joining any religious community that says, please, can we connect with this form of economic thinking?
Kate, thank you so much. Kate Raworth, it was brilliant. This was very inspiring to me. I hope that to our audience too. I hope that this understanding of economics can help us to develop a closer relationship between faith and economic. Because if we want to transform the world, at present, economics is one of the ruling science, at least in terms of politics. So we need to get involved in understanding of economics, in teaching, in the curricula, in practicing, in the images, and trigger our imagination how to change it, because otherwise we will get stuck in the past and we will overshoot the limits of the planetary, of a beautiful planet, and also we'll never get the very poor to the place they deserve to be. So thank you so very much. I hope that you enjoyed it also.
I massively enjoyed it. Thank you so much. So thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this conference and into this really fascinating conversation with you.
And thank you very much again in the name of the Sociedad Argentina de Teología. We'll let you know the outcome of our session.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. A real pleasure.
Thank you, Kate.